This class we learn critical path method, and the next lesson will be continue with critical path method CPM, and this is one of the network analysis system that we discussed in scheduling methods in the previous lesson. So for today, we'll learn diagram, calculate, and interpret critical path method using the arrow diagramming method ADM, and we also explain and diagram the precedence diagramming method PDM, and also calculate, interpret CPM using PDM method. So before we get into the detail with the slide for the critical path method, as you can see here, what is critical path method? It originally developed in 1950s by DuPont, a chemical company. There are two types of method: an arrow diagramming method, ADM, or activity on arrow, AOA. The other method, that precedence diagramming method, PDM, or activity on node, AON. There are also software packages available: MS Project, Microsoft Project, Primavera, and the PDM and precedence diagramming method are mostly used in the industry. So for today, we will learn both method, ADM and PDM, and we continue with that for next class. And let's go back to the node that we have. So critical path method, just remind you, there are two types: arrow diagramming method or activity on arrow, and precedence diagramming method, PDM, or activity on node. So what is the difference between the two by showing you the two diagram that different for the two method. For the ADM or AOA, activity on arrow, so it's one arrow represent for one activity. So let's draw an activity, and this for one activity arrow, and each, of course, we have a node for the beginning, start of activity, and the end of activities. So this method we call that is the ADM or AOA, activity on arrow method. So one arrow stands for one activity. That's why they call it activity on arrow or arrow diagramming method. The second method in the CPM, critical path method, is precedence diagramming method, PDM, or activity on node. So one node represented by one activity. So instead of activity on arrow, the node become the activity. So with that one here, we can have one activity and represent by a node. And now the arrow represent the relationship, not the activity. So just flip between the rows of the arrow and the node for activity and for relationship. So in this case, we have this method called PDM or activity on node. So one node represent one activities. So let's move on to the first type of the critical path method, that is the ADM. So ADM is one of the method as I mentioned, and it can also call that is the AOA, activity on arrow, or even in the textbook they call that is the activity on branch. So what is the definition of that activity on arrow method? So for that activity on arrows, what are the activity we can define? So first we need to have a few definitions. The first one is regular activities. So the activity that requires time and resources. So both time and resources, we call it regular activities. So it need time to complete that activity. It need resources to complete that activity. Then we call it regular activities. The second type of activities we call dummy activities. So by name dummy, they don't those activity do not require time and resources. Just only shows the relationship between the activity that called dummy activity. And the nodes, as shown in here, it represented by the event, Unlike the AON or PDM, the node represent activity. The one for ADM or AOA represent the events for the node. And need to be, when you draw the diagram for ADM, we need to emphasize that no two activities can be identified by the same beginning and end nodes. No two activity can be defined by the same beginning and end nodes. What do I mean by that? So let's continue with the ADM in here. Continue. So what do I mean when I say no two activities can be identified by the same beginning and end nodes? So let's go to two activity here. If we have one activity E, this is activity E represented by an arrows, and we have a node. Let's assume that in node 12, and we have node 15, and then we have another activity called activity F. That activity F in there, and this activity also start on the same node at activity E and end at the same node of activity E. So E and F have the same beginning and end nodes, as you can see here, and the requirement is no two activity can be identified by the same end node. So this should not be used, and that go back to the programming in the past, and you can see the loop like that. When we do the programming, it need to be having a unique identification. E and F defined by the starting node 12 and the end node 15. They are the same, unique start and unique end. So the machine program cannot understand whether when we call that activity start at 12 and end at node 15 is activity E or F. That's why it should not be used. So how can we get away with this? In that situation, we can chain to. Use the dummy activity. So let's start with activity node 12 or event 12. So let's see the F still go to a node. And then we have E. Let's say F. Activity F go to that node. So 12 to 15. If you happen to put that in activity F, then activity E cannot go to same end node 15. We need to have a dummy, so it go to another node that let me call that is 16, and activity E go there. So as you can see, E and F now have the same beginning but not the same end nodes. It's good to have the same relationship as we shown in the finger on the left. Then we can introduce a dummy activity. Connect between node 16 to 15, and that we call this a dummy. And dummy only show the relationship but no time and resources. Let me give example. Example that we use here is the we are going to submit. You are going to submit the legal case review. So example legal case review assignment that we have in this class that going to do. And in this case, as you can see, the first, what you do, you need to search for the case, so that if it activity on arrow, so first we need to have a activity on arrow that represent the search search for the case, search for the material, so that is search. And then after that, when you have the case, you have enough material, you can review and you can read. So with that one, I can have 2 node because I don't want to have the same end and same beginning node. So the activity, when we have that, we can read the case and we can review the case, right? Review. And after we happy to read and reviews, we can start writing the assignments, which is the legal case review, so that you can write, and that write should be after you read and review both of that. Both read and review. So write, follow, review, good, but have to follow read. Then you can introduce a dummy activity that we are talking here. Dummy activities we have here, and write, and at the end, when you write, edit, then you go to Canvas and you submit. And each activity, as you can see here, stand for 1 arrow, and they have introduced a dummy activity at a dash arrow. You saw it in there. So bottom line, go back to here. The regular activity can represent by an arrow, solid, and dummy activity can represent by a dash arrows. Make sense? So that's what we have in the activity on node, or activity on arrow, or arrow diagramming method. So in the next lesson video, we will apply ADM to draw a project schedule in problem 1.